Yes.
Professor Ludlam, when you told patients, let me go back a step. I think you've told the inquiry in the course of the week that patients were told about their ALT results.
Yes.
When you did that, did you send details of the actual results as a matter of routine to the patient's GP?
My hesitation is because I think the system may have changed. Mostly, I would not send detailed results, because mostly the ALT would only be minimally elevated. That was one of the features. If the patient appeared to have particularly high ALT, or there were disturbances of the other liver tests, or the patient had symptoms that might be ascribed to hepatitis, then of course I would mention that in the letter. My hesitation is, I think at one stage we did experiment with, when the letters were typed, there was a sort of automatic way in which laboratory results were sort of tabulated at the end of the letter. I can't remember what became of that. I don't think it was terribly routine, but I think it was an attempt to, because certainly the full blood count results for other patients with hematological disorders would be routinely put at the bottom of the page.
At the meeting in December 1984, that lecture theatre meeting that you've told us about, did you spell out to those who were in attendance that the source of the infection for those who were infected was an SNBTS product?
Oh, that was made clear. And Dr. McClelland, who was the director of the blood transfusion for South East Scotland, was at the meeting and spoke at the meeting and explained the situation.
On the issue of the possibility of AIDS in the blood donor population, I think you've told us earlier in the week that you did make some inquiries about infections in Scotland. Can you recall who you made those inquiries of and when?
I certainly had contact with Dr. John Emsley, who was in the Scottish equivalent in the CDSC in Colindale. He ran the Scottish service. And I think I was in touch with one of our GUM physicians who I knew quite well. He was a colleague. I think that would be probably 1983, but I certainly kept my ears to the ground when I met people who I thought might know, and I didn't get any inkling from the blood transfusion service that they had, if I can put it this way, experienced individuals coming to give donations, and then there being some uncertainty about their suitability. I got no inkling, no suggestion at all from them that there was any reason for concern.
Earlier in the course of your evidence this week, I'd asked you about cryoprecipitate, the use of cryoprecipitate, and in particular we looked at a meeting from February 84 which recorded you saying that cryoprecipitate was preferred in the treatment of children at present because of the new danger of AIDS. You'll recall that, I'm sure. 2 children under your care were infected in 1984 with the SNBTS batch, why were those children not being treated by that time with cryoprecipitate?
Because they both had severe haemophilia and were on home treatment very successfully.
Do you recall, and again, I don't want to ask you a question which leads to any patient identifying information, but do you recall whether you talked to their parents and offered cryoprecipitate as an alternative, even if it meant suspending home treatment?
I don't think I did offer it.
You said in the course of your evidence, again, when I was asking you about the December 84 meeting, that you couldn't tell the 16 infected patients sooner than you did because that would have been logistically problematic. But your evidence suggests that you did invite around 200 patients to make appointments with you in the weeks that followed. Is it really the case that you couldn't have seen those 16 patients within a fairly short span of time as soon as you'd got the results?
It clearly, logistically, would have been possible. I think the difficulty was at our end coming to terms with what had happened and what the implications were. And if we had started to see a few patients, it would very quickly have got round because the patients were very much in touch with each other. It was quite a sort of close-knit community. It would have got round very quickly that I had arranged to see specific individuals and make this information available to them, which would raise anxieties amongst the rest of them. It was I agree, it could have been done, but it was not without consequence. And as I have learnt over the years, you can do things with the best of intentions, and subsequently, in retrospect, one might have done them differently. One is continually learning. We certainly learnt a lot from this episode, this whole awful tragedy that helped us with the hepatitis C and the variant CJD issues later on.
You've talked about the importance of offering HTLV3 testing to the partners of patients who are HTLV3 positive. How did you address the position of the partners of the patients who did not know their HTLV3 positive status?
I need to think about that a little further. I can't give you a straight answer. What I can say is that much of the counselling of these patients and the thinking through the implications of their situation was carried out by Mrs. Geraldine Brown, who's our social worker, and that's something she would, I think, have explored in discussions with patients. And also, should I also say, it was Dr. Alison Richardson, who came in perhaps a little later into our service, but it was very generally known that I was keen that all sexual contacts should be offered testing. Not just the social worker, but the nurses formed patients, not infrequently, latched onto a particular member of staff in the small team and shared their difficulties with that individual. And that system seemed to work fairly well. Everyone knew about sexual transmission and the importance of anti-HPV testing of partners.
Did you take up the post of consultant and director at the Haemophilia Centre because of the opportunities it offered for research with this almost unique group of haemophiliacs?
Oh no. I had been born in Edinburgh, brought up first part of my life there. I've been back as a student. I had worked for 4 years after graduating. I think it's a great place to live. It's got a very good medical school, and I was very lucky indeed to be appointed. Had nothing to do with how the patients with haemophilia were being treated.
I'm going to ask you to look at a document from 1970, which I hope you received from the inquiry this morning. If not, it's a very short passage, so I hope it won't inconvenience you. It's LOTH 40/119_006. You'll see, Professor Ludlam, it's the minutes of a meeting in the Royal Infirmary on the 22nd of July 1970. It's in fact looking at the issue of the outbreak of hepatitis in the Royal Infirmary that you've discussed earlier in your evidence. If we could go please to page 4, Srimek. Could we look at the bottom half of the page? I'm really using this as a convenient reference point, Professor. I don't know if it's a document you ever saw in Edinburgh. The penultimate, so you've got heading Ethics of Clinical Research. The penultimate paragraph says, well, actually, no, I'll pick it up partway through that first main paragraph under the heading Ethics of Clinical Research. The Executive Committee also recommended that all research projects or investigative procedures not directly related to patient management or treatment and involving discomfort or risk should be referred to the Ethics Committee for approval, and that new methods of treatment involving potential risk should be referred for agreement. It had been considered that signed documented consent by the patient should not be obtained, but that the position should be explained to the patient in the presence of a second doctor or state-registered nurse. The fact that permission had been obtained should be put into the case notes. Now, first of all, did you know of these recommendations?
I've not seen this document before, no. Not until about a quarter of an hour before we started this morning.
I think that we sent you another document from 1976, which is a lot similar effect. The reason we've sent them to you, Professor, is obviously because they're local documents. Was what set out here, even though you hadn't seen it, nonetheless your understanding of the procedures that should be applied in relation to research projects?
Well, the last sentence of the first paragraph, I think, is particularly telling. The Executive Committee also recommend that all research projects or investigative procedures not directly related to patient management or treatment, and obviously those involving risk, should be referred. It rather implies that if the research is related to the patient's management, then it perhaps needn't be referred to the Ethics Committee. Now, I've no idea what guidance was given to individuals as to which patients, which projects should be identified as being referred to the ethics committee. Clearly, any project that involves intervention or risk should be. But I just highlight that.
Irrespective of what this document says, what was your guiding principle in the 1980s in terms of an application for referral to the ethics committee or referral to the ethics committee?
I had a very low threshold for seeking ethical approval. As you know, I sought ethical approval for the skin tests, which are hardly invasive. I even sought ethical approval in, I think, December 1984 to undertake anti-HTLV3 testing in all my patients who were receiving concentrate. It seemed self-evident that it was sensible to do that, but it was something new, and someone might view it as experimental. So I wrote and got ethical approval for that.
What about the next paragraph? It suggests that if a patient is participating in clinical research, the position should be explained to the patient in the presence of another doctor or nurse, and it should be recorded in the case notes. Which elements of those did you adhere to?
Yeah. I'm not sure that I would adhere to the witness side of it. As I mentioned earlier, consent for patients one is seeing over a long period of time, you get to know really rather well. And it's important that there is a free exchange of information and views and trust between both parties. It's part of the doctor-patient relationship. And part of that relationship is finding out how the patient is getting along. And part of that relationship is my explaining where we are, what we are doing to monitor their therapy, and tell them what we are doing, and seek their approval for doing so. So it's really very important with any patient that one is in a long-term professional relationship with, in my view, to be very open and honest, straightforward, to build up and maintain trust, because if that isn't successful, then there are difficulties. In relation to signed consent, written consent, I've mentioned earlier how we felt patients didn't need to sign a document, though we did prepare one and wondered whether it would be helpful. I would say that we recorded in the notes of the patients what investigations have been done, as well as the Haemophilia Centre keeping a book with a list. But I've seen some case notes in which the doctor has written out a list of all the individual investigations, including one that says serum to store, the tick beside it. I'm afraid I was a bit more abbreviated. I used to write routine tests and tick it to imply that our routine investigations have been done. So that's the basis on which I felt we had consent from patients. It was part of the relationship with them. They knew me, they knew us, and we mostly got along pretty well together, and the patients were interested in what we were trying to do, as we were interested in them as individuals and part of their families.
Okay. You can take the document down, Seamus, thank you. Again, on a new topic, you, in relation to the Z8 clinical trials in, I think, 1987 onwards, you were not prepared to have your patients involved in clinical trials of PFC products at that stage unless compensation was put in place for adverse events. Is that correct?
That is correct, yes.
And I think you'd advocated for that for a longer period of time prior to 1987.
I first raised the issue in 1983.
Why did you regard it as important?
Because I felt that there was an informal understanding that if a patient suffered as a result of a trial of a PFC product, that the patient would be reasonably compensated financially. It was a sort of an informal understanding, and I thought that wasn't good enough. The ABPI, Association of British Pharmaceutical Industries, had a code of practice and for assessing patients or volunteers, both patients and healthy volunteers, who took part in the assessment of new drugs. And in that assessment arrangement, it was carried out by, I think, three individuals, three prominent, well-informed individuals, I'm sure one of whom was a senior lawyer. And it was a very clear process, an open process, and it seemed as an outsider a reasonable process. There wasn't such a process in existence, as far as I could ascertain, for PFC or SMBTS products. And I was just a bit unhappy about that, and I raised this. Could we not have a system similar to the ABPI? I can't remember all the history of it, but it's a rather tortuous history. That there were long delays in getting government approval. It involved the Treasury, and a whole range of issues got drawn into it. And so it lost its focus, as far as I was concerned. And it came to a bit of a head in, I think it was beginning of 1987. You might be able to correct me, because you probably have the documentation. When I said, well, I'm not going to test anything more from PFC until I get a written assurance that the arrangements are going to be what I and my colleagues consider fair and reasonable. And eventually that did the trick. The Scottish Government eventually agreed. I could go through some of the details, but I'm sure you don't want to hear it.
No, I don't need to ask you the detail, and we do have a number of documents relating to it. Is this right, though, as a matter of fact, you had consistently reported information about reactions to PFC products throughout your time in Edinburgh, whether or not there was a formal clinical trial, for the purpose of adding to knowledge of the pros and cons of the products?
Oh, yes, certainly. any adverse reaction was automatically sent to the blood transfusion, so they had knowledge of significant events, yes.
We're nearing the end, not quite there yet. PRSE 302656. This should, I hope, be the minutes of a UK HCDO meeting on the 16th of June 1989. Yes, so we can see it's an extraordinary general meeting of UK Haemophilia Centre directors to discuss haemophilia, HIV and litigation on the 16th of June. If we can carry on down, please, Shomek. Go to the next page. Sorry, actually, forgive me, Shomek, go back to the first page. Go to the bottom of the page. So we can see representatives of medical defence organisations, Department of Health and legal advisors were there. And then if we go on to the next page, please. Sorry, Shimik, can I have the whole page each time, because I haven't got a note of which page I'm looking for. If we go to the next page, and I'll get to the right one. Yes, so we can see here that previously Dr. Ritzer had done a presentation about allegations being raised. You're then here recorded second half of the page as presenting a document about the history of progress of HIV and haemophilia. And then if we go to the next page, please. We can see, if we keep the whole page, thanks, Shimik, we can see there's a presentation from Dr. Hill, and then the bottom of the page, we then get the interventions or advice from, I think, the medical defence organisations. If we go on to the next page, please. We can then see in paragraph 4, so bottom half of the page, it's being said by Dr. Alsop that haemophilia centre directors should be prepared to take on the role of giving expert advice. And it said if directors didn't agree to act as experts, the plaintiff solicitor would have to seek expert advice from outside the directors group. This would be undesirable and not in the best interests of anyone. Do you know why it was being said it would be undesirable to have the involvement of those who were outside of UK HCDO?
No, except that all the experts, if I can put it this way, were within UK HCDO. So people outside UK HCDO are not in a position to be treating individuals with haemophilia. There was the occasional haematologist, for one reason or another, who looked after a patient with haemophilia at this time, but they would hardly be regarded as an expert. So all the experts were within UK HCDO. Within
the UK, that might be the case, but yes, there could, of course, have been international experts. And was this an attempt for directors to protect themselves and UK HCDO to protect its own?
Oh, I don't think so. No, I think we would have welcomed, at least I can only speak for myself, I would have welcomed experts from outside the UK to come and comment upon the way things had rolled out in the UK.
Can we go to page 11, please, now, Shomek? So if we zoom in on the third paragraph, please. We can see that you say this, Dr. Ludlam, sorry, just to put it in context, top of the page, one or two people had raised the question of continuing to treat patients who were suing them. And then it said it's a matter for the patient and consultant to discuss. Dr. Ludlam said that he asked his patients in front of a witness if they wished still to be treated by him and made a note of the conversations in the patient's file. Dr. Alsop thought it was a good idea to do as Dr. Ludlam did. Why did you have your patients in, those involved in litigation, and asked them in front of a witness if they wanted to continue to be treated by you?
Well, I received, as did other haemophilia directors, summons, or perhaps you call them writs, suggesting that I had fallen below the standard of an ordinary competent haematologist. And therefore it seemed only appropriate either that another physician looked after the patient, or at least I discussed the situation with the patient. It was a dreadful position to put us in, and this was because of government policy. The patients had to demonstrate negligence. I can't think of any better way of splitting up a precious relationship between a patient and his physician than to act in this particular way. And I have to say, I did this for 4 or 5 patients, what is stated here. And I stopped doing it after that because it felt so awful to have to do. But when you're being accused in a legal document of falling below the standard of an average haematologist, when you're trying to do your best, you think you're reasonably well up in the specialty, in a teaching hospital, and until this writ arrived, the patient seemed pleased with the way they were being looked after. So as you know, yes, I think you do know because I was sent some of the correspondence. I wrote to Kenneth Clarke when he was Minister of Health to ask that the government offer no-fault payments and support for the patients. And I wrote to various other MPs in both parties to promote this. And I and I can say all haemophilia treaters were put in an awful position, having a pile of writs saying we were incompetent, with patients that we had loved and looked after. As you see, it was awful, and it made me wonder what on earth was going on at the Department of Health. Here they were funding the health service, trying to support patients, at the same time driving a wedge between a group of very vulnerable patients and their treaters. I think I probably said enough on the topic.
I'm in fact going to ask you to look at the letter you wrote to Mr. Clarke in a moment, but before we leave this document or the issue on this document, as a matter of fact, a patient with a lifelong bleeding disorder living in a particular area is not really going to have much of an alternative, are they, other than to carry on being treated by the centre at which they were infected, potentially under the directorship of the consultant at the time?
You're absolutely right. It's the Hobson's choice. I was the only person with the expertise in southeast Scotland, and at that time, and subsequently, there were situations in which I tried to recruit another consultant to help. And I couldn't find anyone who was prepared to assist me. It's also at a time, I would say in the decade after this, that it became very difficult to recruit into the specialty because of the difficulties that had arisen in relation to all of this.
I'm going to ask now that we look at the letter you wrote to Mr. Clark and use that as it were the springboard for my final questions for you. LOTH 5069_022, please, Shemik. We can see it's November 89 to Kenneth Clark, and you said this: I know that you're aware of the great tragedy that's befallen 1,200 haemophiliacs in the UK who've become infected by HIV. You refer then to the Macfarlane Trust and the payment and say this: whilst this is clearly of some benefit to them, it's a long way short of what might be considered a reasonable settlement as compensation. The campaign to obtain no full compensation for these unfortunate individuals will continue. It's clear it's received a great deal of support. And then you say it would greatly enhance the standing of the government if it could be seen to be caring for the patient. I've been approached by your department to ask if I would be prepared to act as an expert witness in the forthcoming litigation. I'm therefore very familiar with much of the background to the HIV problem and know that such litigation will be potentially very damaging. I very strongly urge you to have discussions with the Haemophilia Society and Macfarlane Trust to try and devise a system of reasonable compensation. After all, many European countries have already gone along this path. Now, I wanted to ask you, first of all, arising from this, about what you say about litigation being potentially very damaging. Not going to put on the screen yet further UK HCDO minutes, but there are a number of UK HCDO meetings at this time at which there is a substantial discussion about litigation, and there was the formation of a litigation group, I think, on which you were included, you, Dr. Jones, Dr. Ritzer and Dr. Savage. Did the work on litigation, which, first of all, the UK HCDO as an organisation decided to undertake, distract or divert that organisation and its members from the core purpose of improving the treatment of haemophilia patients, do you think?
I think that's a very pertinent question, because all of this has had a very detrimental effect upon the development of haemophilia services in the UK. The time spent by many of us has been huge, and staff have found it very demoralizing with all the various investigations and the time spent in writing reports. It has taken us, I think, the minutes you had up on the screen a moment ago, I was glancing at the other day, and I think I said in that meeting that I was given 3 months off from my routine duties in order to be able to compile medical reports in response to this litigation that was arriving around this time. That was very depressing work, took me away from actually providing a service for patients, and was very demoralizing. It's had a dreadful effect upon the whole of haemophilia over the last 20 or more years.
Did the work being undertaken in relation to litigation lead UK HCDO or its clinician members to adopt a closed or overly defensive position, in your view?
Oh, I don't think so. We had nothing to be, I think, particularly defensive about in general. No, I don't think UKHCDO had a particular position. You mentioned that I joined or a small group, litigation group was formed. I'm sorry, I can't remember if we ever actually met or what happened. Perhaps I could add, as the letter to Mr. Clark has been taken down off the screen, I mentioned apparently I had been approached by the DOH to act as an expert witness. I did not act as an expert witness for the impending class action. I was asked by the English health authorities if I would do so, and I agreed, and you have a copy of my draft report to them from that time.
Did the UKHCDO's collective work in response to litigation or the advice and involvement of organisations such as such as the medical defence organisations have the effect of discouraging individual clinicians from providing a full and independent accounts of the events involved?
I don't think so. I think people were very prepared to very openly and straightforwardly explain the history, if it was an individual patient or what policies we'd adopted. I don't recall we were concerned, but I don't think we were being defensive in the way I think you're suggesting we might have been.
In the letter that you wrote to Mr. Clark, I don't think we need to have it back on screen, Seamus, unless the Professor wants, but you urged the government to provide some form of financial recompense, even without an admission of liability. And you talked about, I think, the importance of the government being seen to be caring towards those infected. Was there also some merit in government, the NHS, health boards, UKHCDO, individual clinicians, making some form of public statement of regret for this tragedy at the time?
I think it was the views of UKHCDO members, the physicians, the haemophilia directors, that this was all a terrible tragedy. UKHCDO was not one to issue statements. It's not like a government department with a press office. I think it was clear, at least, that it was a terrible tragedy, a regrettable, terrible tragedy. But I do have a difficulty with some of the statements that come from members of the government when they say that the events should never have occurred, implying that HIV and HCV infection should not have occurred. For prime ministers to make those statements shows to me a paucity, to put it politely, of understanding of the history and the difficulties of the last 50 years. And I'm disappointed when they speak in such terms.
Modern medical practice emphasises the importance of the need for candour, for insight and for reflection when things go wrong, or when things could have been done better than they were. Do you think those qualities were shown by you and your colleagues at the time?
I could always do better. I always try and learn from experiences. I'm sure I could have done things better than I did, and I have certainly learnt from the experiences of those years.
Looking back
and I'm sorry, I agree that there's now a more open way of being able to discuss when things go wrong. That is sometimes difficult, I have to say, when you suddenly find that you get a writ from a patient's solicitor accusing you of negligence, and you're then expected to go on looking after the patient. Not only that, but the patient seems pleased to come and see me, rather see me than another physician who might actually have been more appropriate to look after the patient. So it's a very difficult situation, and one that takes some difficulty to accommodate, is when you have a writ for negligence, and at the same time the patient is keen to come and see you. It doesn't make life terribly easy. I'm delighted to see the patients, but it is difficult. I think much has improved as a result of the terrible tragedies of HIV, not just in haemophilia, but in the wider community, and what we have learnt in medicine as a result of the consequences, not the medical consequences, the social consequences and the medical consequences of HIV, and the way we practice medicine now is completely different from how it was in the early 1980s. Much for the better, I add.
And looking back now, what do you wish you had done differently? I wish I had perhaps been more proactive in encouraging patients to come up and find out about their HTLV3 results. If there hadn't been the Yorkshire Post and the need to have, or the way I had responded by having the meeting in 19th of December 84, then the process of informing the patients would have rolled out in a much more reasonable and controlled way. And I think patients would have been better managed as a group. But it was this, it was difficult enough to manage the many issues raised by HIV without the difficulties of the Yorkshire Post. Are there any other observations you would want to make about the way in which you or your colleagues or the NHS bodies with which you were associated responded to the events with which this inquiry is concerned?
I suppose I'm surprised by some of the comments that I've received from the Rule 9 requests. patients apparently not understanding their situation, which I found didn't quite accord with my reflections of the individuals. Now that may reflect the passage of time for myself and for the patient. But I suppose it's emphasized to me the importance, which can't, I suppose, be overemphasized, of spending time thinking through with the patient their situation. And I think perhaps checking out more that they have understood what I think I have said to them. I think one of the things I have learnt over the years, and this applies beyond this particular situation, is the importance of not making assumptions. One has to make assumptions all the time to get through life, every day. But to check things out more carefully as to what a patient understands, and not only a patient, but when I'm talking to my friends and relatives, I'm more careful now to check out that they've understood what I'm saying, and I've understood them.
So unless Mr. Hill tells me that there have been any further questions suggested, those are my questions for Professor Ludlam. I don't know whether Mr. Reid has any questions.
No, I don't. Sir, thank you for the invitation, but it's a thank you, but no thank you from me.
So before I ask Professor Ludlam if there's anything further he wants to add.
I do just have two questions. At the moment, I'm looking at you, Mr. Reid, so I'd rather look at Professor Ludlam. No disrespect intended.
I'll turn my camera off.
Oh, I can't see anything now.
We can see you now.
We can see you now.
Okay.
Just two matters. To take you back, really, to part of today's testimony and part of yesterday's, when we were talking about AIDS and the tests. The AIDS study that we talked about earlier today, when did you get the first results from it, do you think?
Oh, they were back within a week or two. And we started, I can't remember exactly, but perhaps in February 83. So I'd have had some results by March 83. I have those dates in my mind because, as you may recall, I wrote to the Lancet in response to a letter of Robert Gordon's. And I think my letter was written perhaps in April 83.
And
so we must have had a reasonable number of results by then.
You described the effect on you today in these terms, that you were very surprised and perplexed and quite a bit of puzzlement. So it came as a bit of a shock to you, did it? Because you had expected that there would be no problem with those who had been on Scottish PFC concentrate.
Yes.
You're nodding.
Yes.
The reason I asked that is when you were asked the day before, actually the 2nd of December, about the tests which were done by Dr. Tedder for you, you put it in almost exactly the same terms, that you were in effect shocked at the results because you hadn't expected any adverse results.
Yes. Well, I would say that my degree of shock was far greater with Dr. Tedder. In 1983, it was more puzzlement and surprise and wonder about the results, because I didn't think in 1983 that the abnormalities that I was finding were due to a putative AIDS virus or AIDS virus, yeah.
Although you did know by then that such findings were known to exist in those who had later or were diagnosed as suffering from AIDS.
Yes. Individuals with AIDS had much more severe immune abnormalities than I had demonstrated or I had found in my patients. And the memory, the sort of results that I was finding were the same order of magnitude as were reported by Michael Lederman and a colleague, the other paper in the New England Journal in January 1983, in the asymptomatic people with haemophilia.
Now, when Dr. Tedder spoke to the Lindsay Tribunal, the passage that Council took you to on the 2nd of December, she quoted to you what he had said, that Christopher Ludlam obviously getting more and more pensive and me feeling less and less kind as this evolution of damage done to a cohort evolved. That was the very early testing when he sent us cohorts of samples, which he already had a clinical suspicion that something had occurred. And that was the beginning of the evolution of knowledge of the Edinburgh context. And you said, no, you had no clinical suspicion. Can you clarify for me whether by the time you got the reports back from Tedder, you did or didn't have a clinical suspicion at that time? I'm trying to reconcile these two accounts.
I didn't have any clinical suspicion. It was only when I got the results back, probably of the larger number, perhaps the second batch, and that I went through who the patients were, and I saw that one of them was the individual who had the operation in, I think it was March or April 1984, and had a horrendous post-operative course. It was only when I saw that his result was positive that I began to wonder whether it was actually due to the HIV. And because we had these stored samples, I could go back and see that he was negative before and he was positive afterwards. And it then began to make sense, although I don't think anyone had previously described anything like this in the literature. And that's why I wrote it up for others to learn from our experience, because it was a frightening episode.
So in the study which had been designed to monitor patients' progress so far as immune systems were concerned, and your surprise and astonishment at the results a while earlier than your discussion or your conversation with Dr. Tedder had given you no suspicion at all that something might be untoward?
There was still puzzlement. As I mentioned this morning, one of the things that was positive, if I can put it that way, was that the immune tests, these lymphocyte tests, didn't seem to decline over time. They were static. So that gave me a bit of confidence. And as I mentioned, I think this morning, when we did the skin tests, they didn't change over time either. So again, that was good. Didn't it was reassuring, I should say, because one of the, as I was hinting this morning, one of the other possibilities was that AIDS could occur in people with haemophilia as a result of, if you like, side effects of the impurities in the concentrate. And I was fascinated to read minutes of a meeting that were sent to me as part of the documentation prior to this week. Minutes of a meeting in February 1984 at the National Institute for Biological Standards and Control, discussing infections transmitted by blood. And in that, Dr. Tedder was talking about the cause of AIDS. And he said, well, there are sort of 2 points of view. One is that it's due to a virus. And at the other end of the spectrum, it's not due to a virus, it's due to side effects of the contaminants in the blood products. And he said the truth probably lies somewhere between the two. I was fascinated to read that in February 1984 from a virologist, prominent, not at this stage in the field, but in the field of hepatitis B. He was an international expert, and as we all know, came into this field, what he described himself as a recycled hepatitis B virologist. But I was fascinated to read that even a virologist took that breadth of view in February 1984.
So that suggestion might be read as being that those who had an overload of protein causing alterations to their immune system might have been more predisposed than others to fall victim to the HIV virus once they were exposed to it in the form of developing AIDS.
We demonstrated from our analysis of the cohort, if I can put it that way, the individuals who got this infected batch, that not only were people with the abnormal lymphocyte tests more likely to get infected, but those who used, in general, more factor VIII in the year, in fact, in the previous 3 years, were more likely to get infected. So they were predisposed.
And that's by factor VIII, you mean factor VIII concentrate?
Yes, yes. So they were predisposed in 2 ways. One is, they would get, if they got a lot of factor VIII in general, not from the implicated batch, but over the years, if they were big users, when they were exposed to the virus, they were more likely to get infected.
Thank you.
We also demonstrated if they got more bottles, as you know, of the batch, they were more likely to get infected. So there was an underlying, in my view, an underlying predisposition to infections, not just HIV, but perhaps TB and Candida as well, as a result of their concentrate therapy.
Thank you. The second question relates to the letter to Ken Clarke. At the time that that letter was written, 29th of November 1989, did you know that suggestions were being made about you and your own practice in Edinburgh?
Well, I had received writs before that. I think the first writ I received was 1988. I received several, I think, in 1988, of patients who were told that they had to demonstrate negligence before they would receive support.
And when was it that you first raised the question of compensation being paid on a no-fault basis? Do you recall? Was it this letter to Ken Clarke or not?
I think I wrote to MPs in 1987 when all the difficulties were starting to roll out. I wrote to a number of MPs to say that the government should consider some way in which it can help these individuals.
And by difficulties, what do you mean?
They were starting to become ill. They needed more support. There was a lot of need by the particularly support for the patients. They became less well. They needed to spend more. Simple things like heating. I remember a patient who got central heating in his house. I think paid for by the Macfarlane Trust, and how much better he felt for actually being warm. If you've got arthritis, it's not good being cold if you're warm. And I was amazed, actually. He volunteered this. One time I saw him, it was good.
Thank you. That's all that I have to ask. Ms. Richards.
Professor Ludlam, there are no further questions for you. Is there anything further that you would wish to say?
I would thank you for hearing me out this week, and I'm sorry I've been a bit slow on occasions. I would thank the inquiry for, if I can put it this way, the additional question at the end of the long list of questions for my Rule 9 response. The additional question of is there anything further that I'd like to add? And I note that today much of what I put in to this invitation has been considered, and I thank the inquiry for doing so. I don't think I've got anything further to add than what I did in that in the paragraphs I put into that response to the offer, and I appreciated the invitation. The only other thing I think I would say is I wish the inquiry well. I look forward to seeing the report, and I hope it is of help to everyone who's been affected by these terrible tragedies.
Well,
thank you.
Well, thank you for those words. And I'd like to thank you also for your evidence, which is not so much slow, I think, as the word Richard Tedder used, pensive on occasions, perhaps. You will understand how sometimes oral evidence can be of real importance. And yours, if I may say so, has been for much of the time riveting, certainly revealing in a way that the printed page of the witness statement cannot easily be, and certainly informative, particularly for someone who has been at the helm in Edinburgh throughout much of the period with which the inquiry is focused. I'm sorry that we've made you work overtime today, but I thank you for having done so. You are the first, I think, witness who has, as it were, had a week to yourself. So it's a long and grueling time, I'm quite sure. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sir Brian.
And so we resume on Monday at 10 with the evidence of Dr. Pettigrew. We'll then continue on Tuesday with the evidence of Professor Han, which may continue on to Wednesday morning. And then we have the evidence of Professor Lowe for the remainder of the week.
Yes, so it's 10 o'clock on Monday morning. Thank you very much.